I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The British Library was a cathedral of silence, a place where the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of unread thoughts and ancient parchment. In the reading room, scholars sat like statues, their movements restricted to the rhythmic turning of pages and the soft scratching of fountain pens. Miss Jane Marple, visiting London for a week to stay with her nephew Raymond West, sat at a polished mahogany desk in the corner. She was not researching the Crusades or the lineage of the Plantagenets. She was, as she put it, merely catching up on a bit of local history from her own notes. In reality, her pale blue eyes were taking in the peculiar social ecosystem of the scholars around her. "It is quite fascinating, Raymond," she had whispered to her nephew earlier that morning. "People here are very like the choir in St. Mary Mead. They all have their assigned places, and heaven help the person who sits in the wrong chair or sneezes during a solo." Directly across from her sat Professor Alistair Thorne, a man whose tweed jacket looked as though it were held together primarily by ink stains and stubbornness. He was hunched over a collection of Elizabethan manuscripts, his fingers twitching with an agitation that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Beside him was Dr. Helena Vane, a younger, sharply dressed academic whose ambition was as visible as her perfectly manicured nails. The tension between them was palpable, a cold, scholarly war over a shared field of study. The peace was shattered not by a scream, but by a dull, rhythmic thud. It came from the restricted manuscripts vault, a small, climate-controlled room visible through a glass partition. Mr. Henderson, the head archivist, a man of precise habits and even more precise temperament, had entered the vault moments before to retrieve a rare 15th-century volume. Now he was slumped against the glass, his face pressed into a grotesque mask of surprise. His hand was outstretched, clawing at the air, before he slid slowly down to the floor. The reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. Professor Thorne dropped his pen, leaving a dark blot on the parchment. Dr. Vane stood up so abruptly her chair scraped harshly against the marble floor. Security guards hurried toward the vault, but the electronic lock, designed to protect the nation's treasures, remained stubbornly engaged. Miss Marple stood up, her knitting bag clutched to her chest. She did not join the throng of panicked scholars crowding the glass. Instead, she moved to the side, watching the faces of those who watched the dying man. She noticed the way Professor Thorne's hand flew to his pocket, and how Dr. Vane's expression shifted from shock to something that looked remarkably like relief. "The poor man," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "It reminds me so much of Mr. Tilling, the village grocer. He always insisted on keeping his best preserves in the back of the cellar behind a locked door. He said it was for safety, but it only meant that when the shelving gave way, nobody could get to him in time to help. By the time the paramedics arrived and the vault door was forced open, Mr. Henderson was dead. On his desk lay a manuscript that had been pristine only an hour ago. Now it was stained with a dark, oily substance that seemed to have seeped from the very pages he had been touching. The British Library, a bastion of knowledge and order, had become a crime scene, and Miss Marple, standing quietly by the exit, noticed a single tiny detail that the frantic security team had overlooked. The ventilation grate above the vault was missing one of its 4 silver screws, and a faint, sweet scent of almonds was beginning to drift through the room. The news of the tragedy at the British Library rippled through the academic circles of London with the speed of a scandal in a country parish. By the following morning, the prestigious reading room remained cordoned off, but the surrounding corridors and the nearby cafes in Bloomsbury were teeming with hushed conversations and pointed fingers. Scholars who had spent decades in solitary study were suddenly transformed into amateur sleuths, each offering a theory more convoluted than the last. The death of Mr. Henderson was no longer a tragedy, it was a puzzle, a disruption of the sacred order that demanded an explanation. Miss Marple sat in the corner of a small tea shop on Museum Street, her pale blue eyes watching the steam rise from her porcelain cup. Beside her, Raymond West was venting his frustration. He had intended to spend the week showing his aunt the cultural highlights of the city, not escorting her to the scene of a suspected poisoning. "It's absurd, Aunt Jane," Raymond said, leaning across the table. "The police are treating it as an accident, some sort of chemical reaction with the preservatives in the old vellum, but Reform Club gossip is quite different. They're saying Henderson was about to expose a forgery that would have ruined a dozen reputations." Miss Marple nodded gently, her fingers busy with a small piece of lace she was mending. "It is very often the case, Raymond, that people fear the truth more than they value a man's life. It reminds me of the time the local postmaster in St. Mary Mead was found in the pond. Everyone said he had simply slipped, but I couldn't help but notice that he was wearing his Sunday shoes on a Tuesday. People only put on their best when they have something very important to prove or something very difficult to hide." Mr. Henderson was a man of immense precision. He would not have been careless with chemicals. Around them, researchers and library staff occupied the tables, their voices carrying through the quiet shop. Professor Alistair Thorne was sitting only a few feet away, holding court with a group of terrified-looking graduate students. His voice, usually a dry rasp, was now sharp with indignation. "It's a disgrace," Thorne declared, loud enough for the entire room to hear. The man was obsessive. He treated those manuscripts like his own children. He must have been using some illegal detergent to remove the stains he found. Vanity, that's what killed him. The vanity of a man who thought he knew better than the restorers. From another table, Dr. Helena Vane offered a cool, contradictory perspective. She didn't raise her voice, but its icy clarity cut through Thorne's bluster. "Obsession is a motive, Alistair, but not necessarily for an accident. We all know Henderson was blocking the publication of the Thorne-Vane collaboration. He claimed the central manuscript was a clever 18th century imitation. If he had lived to present his findings to the board, your career and mine would have been effectively over. To call it an accident is a convenience for us, certainly, but is it the truth?" The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of her words settled. The rivalry between Thorne and Vane was well known, but the suggestion of a career-saving murder was a new, dangerous element in the village-like atmosphere of the library. Miss Marple watched as Professor Thorne's hand gripped his saucer until his knuckles turned white. She also noted the way Dr. Vane's eyes flickered toward the door every time a new customer entered, as if she were expecting someone who hadn't yet arrived. "Gossip is a very curious thing," Miss Marple murmured to Raymond. "It is like a river. It carries a great deal of debris, but if you look closely at what settles on the bottom, you find the heavy truth. Everyone is talking about forgeries and reputations, but no one is talking about the missing screw in the ventilation grate. It's the small domestic details that tell the story, like Mrs. Pringle's curtains. Everyone thought she changed them because they were faded, but she actually changed them so the neighbors couldn't see who was visiting her at night. People focus on grand motives and forget that a crime is usually a very practical solution to a very personal problem." As they left the tea shop, Miss Marple observed a young man standing by the entrance, looking utterly distraught. He was a junior archivist named Thomas, who had worked directly under Henderson. A man was questioning him in a plain grey suit, who had the unmistakable air of a detective. Thomas was shaking his head, his face pale and wet with tears. "He didn't make mistakes," Thomas sobbed. "He was the most careful man I ever knew. He wouldn't have used a cleanser without testing it first. Someone did this to him." Miss Marple paused to adjust her scarf, lingering just long enough to see the detective's dismissive nod. The police were looking for an accident, and academics were looking for a scandal. No one, it seemed, was looking for a murderer, but as she watched the shadows lengthen against the British Museum, Miss Marple knew that the pattern was just beginning to emerge. The village of St. Mary Mead had taught her that where there is smoke, There is usually someone trying to hide the fire. The official investigation, led by Inspector Slack, who had been recently transferred to the London Metropole and seemed entirely out of his element among the dust of centuries, was proceeding with its usual blundering vigour. Slack had convinced himself that the oily substance on the manuscript was a volatile compound used by the late Mr. Henderson in an unauthorized restoration attempt. To Slack, the case was about industrial safety and bureaucratic negligence. He spent the afternoon barking orders at the library's custodial staff and demanding logs of every chemical purchased by the archives department over the last 5 years. He viewed the scholars as mere inconveniences and the library itself as a cluttered warehouse that needed a thorough cleaning. Miss Marple, through a series of delicate maneuvers involving a misplaced umbrella and a very polite request for a glass of water, had managed to remain in the vicinity of the restricted manuscripts vault. She sat on a small velvet bench in the hallway, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to fade into the background noise of the building. She appeared to be nothing more than a patient aunt waiting for her nephew, but her mind was cataloguing the movements of everyone who passed the glass partition. She watched as Thomas, the distraught junior archivist, was allowed back into the anteroom to collect some personal belongings. The young man was trembling, his hands hovering over the desks as if he feared the very furniture might be lethal. "It is a very difficult thing, being young and losing a mentor," Miss Marple said softly as Thomas walked past her bench. The young man stopped, blinking at her as if she had just materialized from the air. "I remember when the old clockmaker in our village passed away. His apprentice, young Billy, felt quite lost. He kept expecting the clocks to stop because the master wasn't there to wind them. But clocks, like libraries, have a way of continuing, don't they? Though they do require a very specific kind of care." Thomas sat beside her, his head in his hands. "He didn't use chemicals, Miss Marple. He hated them. He said the only thing the old manuscript needed was the right humidity and a respectful touch. The inspector thinks he was being reckless, but it's impossible. Mr. Henderson was checking the De Vere manuscript yesterday because he thought he found a hidden watermark, one that didn't belong to the 15th century. He was going to prove the Thorn vein discovery was a hoax." Miss Marple's needles slowed for a moment. "A hidden watermark. How very clever. It reminds me of the time the local lace maker thought she had found a rare pattern from the French court. It turned out to be a very modern imitation, detectable only if one looked at the way the threads were knotted at the back. People who create shams often forget that the back of a thing must be as perfect as the front. But tell me, Thomas, who else had a key to the vault? Surely a head archivist doesn't work entirely alone. Only Professor Thorne and Dr. Vane had temporary clearance, Thomas whispered, glancing nervously at a security guard. They were the ones who brought the manuscript in for verification, and of course the maintenance crew had access to the ventilation system last week. There was a complaint about a damp smell. Miss Marple thanked him, and as he walked away, she stood up to stretch her legs. She wandered toward the glass partition of the vault, peering through with a look of mild curiosity. To anyone watching, she was merely admiring the architecture. In truth, she was looking at the floor. Beneath the ventilation grate she had noticed earlier, there was a tiny, almost invisible dusting of white powder on the dark carpet. It was not the oily substance that had killed Henderson, but something dry and fine. She thought of the missing screw and the sweet scent of almonds. In St. Mary Mead, the smell of almonds was most often associated with the kitchen, but it was also the signature of cyanide. However, cyanide would have acted instantly, and Henderson had been in that vault for nearly 20 minutes before he collapsed. No, the oily substance on the book was the delivery system, but the ventilation grate was the true mystery. Why would a murderer tamper with a vent if they intended to use a contact poison on a page? The pattern was becoming more complex. It was like the time the village doctor's bag was stolen. Everyone assumed it was for the drugs, but it turned out the thief only wanted the bag itself to carry a stolen ham from the larder. The obvious motive was often a shroud for a much simpler, more mechanical necessity. As Inspector Slack's voice echoed through the hall shouting about inventory lists, Miss Marple noticed Dr. Helena Vane standing at the far end of the corridor. She was not looking at the vault, she was looking at the ventilation shaft that ran along the ceiling, and her expression was one of intense, cold calculation. Inspector Slack's patience, never a particularly abundant resource, had finally evaporated. He had found what he considered the smoking gun, or in this case, the smoking bottle. A search of the faculty lockers had unearthed a small, unlabeled vial of a pungent, viscous fluid hidden at the back of Professor Alistair Thorne's personal cabinet. The substance matched the chemical profile of the oily residue found on the De Vere manuscript. To Slack, this was the definitive conclusion of a textbook investigation. Thorne had the motive, the preservation of his academic reputation, and now he had been caught with the means. The professor was promptly escorted to a small windowless office for questioning, his face a mask of purple-hued indignation that Slack interpreted as the frantic blustering of a guilty man. Miss Marple sat in the main foyer of the library, her knitting abandoned in favor of a small leather-bound notebook she had used for years to track the blooming cycles of her garden. Raymond West was pacing nearby, his face a picture of intellectual distress. "They've got him, Aunt Jane." Slack is convinced Thorne poisoned the pages to prevent Henderson from exposing the forgery. It's a tragic end to a brilliant, if abrasive, career. I suppose the pressure of being found out as a fraud simply drove him to an act of desperation. "It is certainly a very dramatic theory, Raymond," Miss Marple replied, her voice as soft as the rustle of old paper. "And Professor Thorne is indeed a man of very strong temper. He reminds me quite vividly of Mr. Gregson, who used to run the hardware shop in the village. Mr. Gregson once threw a heavy spanner at a customer who suggested his nails were overpriced. He was a man of sudden, violent impulses, but he was also a man who never hid his tracks. If he was going to do something wicked, he did it in the middle of the high street for all to see. To hide a bottle in one's own locker seems, well, it seems far too clumsy for a man as meticulously arrogant as the professor." "But the evidence is there, Aunt Jane. The bottle was in his locker." "Yes," Miss Marple mused, "and that is exactly what makes it so very suspicious. If I were a clever scholar intending to commit a murder, I would think I would find a much more imaginative place for the poison than my own coat pocket. It's like the time the churchwarden's silver was found under the curate's bed. Everyone thought the poor boy was a thief, but it turned out the real culprit had put it there simply because he knew no one would ever think the curate capable of such a thing until they were forced to see it. It was a redirect, Raymond, a way of pointing the finger so loudly that no one bothers to look at the hand doing the pointing." While Slack continued his interrogation, Miss Marple noticed Dr. Helena Vane walking across the marble hall. She was carrying a stack of reference books, her movements graceful and entirely composed. She did not look like a woman whose colleague had just been arrested for murder. She looked like a woman who had finally been given enough room to breathe. Miss Marple watched her stop by a trash receptacle and delicately dispose of a pair of thin latex gloves. It was a perfectly reasonable action for a researcher handling delicate materials, yet there was a precision to the movement that felt remarkably final. The investigation was leaning heavily toward the obvious, but Miss Marple was thinking about the junior archivist, tears, and the missing screw in the ceiling. If the oily substance on the manuscript was indeed the cause of death, why was there a need for a dry white powder on the floor? And why did the room smell of almonds only after the tragedy had occurred? It occurred to her that the oily substance might not have been the poison at all, but merely the bait, a way to ensure that Henderson's hands would be occupied and his attention diverted, while the real mechanism of death was deployed from above. She thought about how Dr. Vane had looked at the ventilation shaft. In St. Mary Mead, the most successful deceptive acts were always the ones that allowed the victim to contribute to their own downfall. It was like the annual raffle, where old Mrs. Gable always seemed to win the best hamper. People thought it was luck, but Mrs. Gable simply knew exactly which ticket to nudge toward the person drawing the numbers. The murderer hadn't just placed a bottle in a locker, they had staged an entire scene to ensure that when the curtain rose, the audience would only see the man they were meant to see. "I think, Raymond," Miss Marple said, standing up and smoothing her skirts, "that I should like to have a small word with that young man Thomas again. He mentioned a damp smell in the vault last week. In my experience, a damp smell in an old building is rarely just water, it is often the smell of something being prepared." Miss Marple found Thomas in the small cafeteria, staring blankly into a cup of cold tea. The young archivist looked like he had aged a decade in the last 24 hours. He barely looked up as she settled into the chair opposite him, her knitting bag placed carefully on the table between them. To anyone else she was merely a kind old lady offering sympathy. To Thomas, she was a quiet anchor in a world that had suddenly become untethered. She did not start with questions about the murder, but rather with a gentle observation about the library's historic architecture. "It is a marvel how these old buildings breathe, Thomas," she began, her voice a soothing contrast to the clatter of the kitchen. "All those shafts and pipes hidden behind the grand marble. It reminds me of the old manor house in St. Mary Mead. They installed a modern heating system back in the 30s, and for months the cook complained of a strange whistling sound in the larder. Everyone thought it was ghosts, of course, but it was actually just a loose flap of tin in the ductwork. It's remarkable how much a tiny piece of metal can change the atmosphere of a room. You mentioned a damp smell in the vault last week. Did the maintenance crew ever find the source?" Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to pull his mind away from his grief. "They said it was a blocked filter in the air purification system. The vault has its own dedicated air supply to prevent mold on the vellum. But when they opened the vent, they didn't find any water. They just replaced the charcoal filters and said the smell should dissipate. It still annoyed Mr. Henderson, though. He said it smelled synthetic, like a dry cleaner's shop." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Synthetic. How very interesting. And did you happen to see the crew, Thomas? Were they the usual men from the library staff?" "No," Thomas said, shaking his head. "They were contractors, a company called Pristine Air. They wore those heavy grey coveralls and masks. I didn't think much of it at the time. The library is always undergoing some sort of specialized renovation. But now that I think about it, Dr. Vane was the one who authorized the emergency work. She said the humidity levels were fluctuating dangerously." Miss Marple thanked him and made her way back toward the restricted area, her mind working through a very specific sequence of events. She knew that the oily substance on the manuscript was indeed a contact irritant, but its purpose was not to kill. It was designed to cause a physical reaction, perhaps a stinging of the eyes or a shortness of breath, that would force the victim to gasp, and if one gasps in a room where the air supply has been compromised, the results are far more efficient than any poisoned page could ever be. She found herself back at the glass partition, looking up at the ventilation grate. The missing screw was the key. If someone had access to the ducts from the maintenance corridor behind the vault, they could have easily introduced a volatile gas into the dedicated airline. The white powder she had seen on the carpet wasn't poison at all. It was simple chalk dust, used to mark the alignment of the vent so it could be replaced in total darkness. The murderer had worked from inside the walls, like a moth in a wardrobe. She leaned in closer, her spectacles catching the light. Near the base of the wall, hidden just behind a heavy mahogany filing cabinet, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a small, discarded plastic tab. the kind used to seal a pressurized canister of industrial refrigerant. But this tab was bright red, a color that did not match the standard blue or green used by the library's actual maintenance contractors. It was a small domestic error, the kind of mistake made by someone who is very clever with books, but not quite so familiar with the practicalities of hardware. It reminded her of Miss Hartnell's nephew, who tried to fix his own plumbing and ended up using a garden hose attachment on the kitchen sink. He was a brilliant mathematician, but he simply didn't understand that certain tools only fit certain jobs. The person who had tampered with the vent had used a specialized canister, something used in chemical labs for the rapid cooling of volatile compounds. And who in the library would have access to such a canister and the knowledge of how to bypass an air filter? She looked toward the office where Dr. Helena Vane was currently being interviewed as a character witness for Professor Thorne. The doctor had been the one to report the damp smell, the one to authorize the contractors, and the one who knew the exact humidity requirements of the De Vere manuscript. She had created a problem so that she could provide a fatal solution. The oily substance was merely a distraction, a way to ensure that the police would find a bottle in a locker and look no further. Miss Marple sat back down on her bench, her knitting needles resuming their steady click-clack. The clue was no longer hidden, but the proof was another matter entirely. In St. Mary Mead, one didn't always need a confession to catch a thief. Sometimes, one simply needed to wait for them to try and fix their mistake. She knew that the red plastic tab was the thread that would unravel the entire tapestry provided she could find the right moment to pull it. The arrest of Professor Thorne had acted as a catalyst for a sudden, frantic outpouring of professional grievances and long-buried academic resentments. As Miss Marple sat in the library's opulent oak-panelled reading room, she could hear the echoes of hushed arguments drifting from the private study carols. The scholarly world, usually so insulated and dignified, was beginning to tear at its own seams. Raymond West had returned from a brief foray into the administrative wing with a look of profound astonishment on his face. He sat down beside his aunt, leaning in so close that his voice was a mere vibration in the air. "It's far worse than a simple forgery, Aunt Jane," Raymond whispered. "I've just been speaking with the librarian's assistant. It appears that the Thorne-Vane partnership wasn't a partnership at all. There is a rumor, a very substantiated one it seems, that Dr. Vane discovered the original manuscript in a private collection in Italy 3 years ago. She brought it to Thorne for his expertise, but he leveraged his position as her senior advisor to claim co-discovery. He essentially held her career hostage. If she didn't share the credit, he would ensure she never received tenure. She was a brilliant woman being hollowed out by a man who had more power than talent. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of deep, quiet sympathy. "It is a very old story, Raymond. It reminds me of the dressmaker in our village, Miss Trimmer. She had a young apprentice who was a genius with a needle, but Miss Trimmer took all the orders and all the praise. The poor girl worked in the back room for pennies while the mistress wore silk. People can only be squeezed for so long before they begin to look for a way to stop the pressure. But what about Mr. Henderson? Why was he the one to suffer?" "That's the most tragic part," Raymond responded. "Henderson was the only one who suspected the truth. He wasn't just investigating the watermark, he was investigating the provenance of the manuscript itself. He had found letters suggesting that Dr. Vane had acquired the book much earlier than she claimed. If he had proven that Thorne and Vane had lied about the timeline, it wouldn't just be a forgery scandal, it would be a fraud investigation involving thousands of pounds in grant money. They were both in it together, but they hated each other for it." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her eyes were fixed on the doorway where Dr. Helena Vane had just appeared. The doctor was no longer wearing her professional white coat. She was dressed in a sharp charcoal grey suit that gave her the appearance of a corporate executive. She was speaking to a group of university lawyers, her gestures precise and authoritative. She looked like a woman who was finally taking control of a situation that had once been beneath her feet. "You see, Raymond," Miss Marple said softly, "when two people are tied together by a secret, they are like two people tied together in a sack. They can only move if they agree on the direction, or if one of them decides to cut their way out. Professor Thorne was the obvious choice for a villain, because he was loud and arrogant. But Dr. Vane is the one who has everything to gain from his downfall. With Thorne in prison and Henderson dead, she is the sole surviving authority on the DeVere manuscript. She will inherit reputation, research, and future. She hasn't just escaped the sack, she's inherited the whole house." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic tapping. It was the sound of Inspector Slack's heels on the marble floor. He looked frustrated, his face flushed a dark, angry red. He had spent the last 2 hours trying to get a confession out of Thorne, but the professor had done nothing but shout about his constitutional rights and the incompetence of the Metropolitan Police. Slack was now looking for a new target for his irritation, and his eyes landed on Miss Marple. "Still here, are you?" Slack grumbled, stopping in front of them. "Look, this isn't a village bake sale. We've got a serious situation. The chemical analysis of that bottle is taking forever, and the professor is being about as helpful as a brick wall. If you've got something to say, say it now, or please, for the love of all that's holy, go back to your hotel." Miss Marple looked up at him, her smile as sweet and innocent as a summer morning. "I was just thinking about the Pristine Air Contractors, Inspector. It's a great name for a company, isn't it? Though I do wonder if they've ever done work for a chemical laboratory. The red plastic tab I found near the vault, the one I mentioned to the constable, really is quite a specific shade of red. It reminded me of the labels on the liquid nitrogen canisters they use at the hospital. I imagine a scientist like Dr. Vane would be very familiar with that kind of equipment." Slack stared at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as the gears of his mind finally began to turn. He didn't say thank you, he simply turned on his heel and marched toward the administrative office, his pace even faster than before. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back to her knitting. She knew that the lawyers and the scholars were still playing a game of reputations, but the real game, the one involving a missing screw and a red plastic tab, was finally reaching its conclusion. While Inspector Slack was busy chasing the paper trail of pristine air, a new and far more physical complication emerged from the bowels of the library. It began with a frantic call from the basement boiler room, where a maintenance worker had discovered a secondary breach in the ventilation trunking. This was not the neat, clinical tampering Miss Marple had observed in the vault upstairs, but a jagged, desperate hole hacked into the metal with what appeared to be a heavy fire axe. Within this cavity, hidden behind a stack of discarded archives, lay a second body. It was not a scholar this time, but a man in the grey coveralls of a specialized contractor. He had been dead for at least 48 hours, his face a grimace of frozen agony that spoke of a sudden, violent end. The discovery sent a fresh wave of panic through the building, effectively ending Slack's focus on the scholarly motives of Professor Thorne. The victim was identified as Elias Vance, no relation to the earlier mystery of the gate, but a man with a long history of industrial espionage and a particular talent for bypassing high-security air systems. In his pocket was a set of keys that did not belong to any maintenance company, but bore the distinct engraved crest of the library's executive board. The narrative of a disgruntled scholar was suddenly superseded by something far more professional and far more sinister. It appeared that Mr. Henderson had not been the only target, or perhaps he had not been the intended target at all. Miss Marple sat in the shadowed corner of the hallway as the gurney was wheeled past, her pale eyes fixed on the grey sleeve of the dead man. She noticed a faint yellowish stain on the cuff, one that smelled faintly of the same synthetic odour Thomas had described. She turned to Raymond, who was now visibly trembling. "You see, Raymond," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos, We often assume a play has only one director, but sometimes two people are trying to put on two different shows on the same stage. Dr. Vane wanted a murder that looked like an academic accident, but someone else wanted a theft that looked like a tragedy. It reminds me of the time the church roof was being repaired. The vicar thought the workmen were fixing the lead, but the workmen were actually using the scaffolding to steal the bells. They were both right about the noise, but they were both wrong about the purpose. But who is the second man, Aunt Jane, and why kill him? Raymond asked, his voice hushed. He was the tool, dear boy. A tool that became too sharp or perhaps too expensive. If you hire a thief to help you commit a crime, you must eventually face the fact that the thief knows your secret. In St. Mary Mead, the most dangerous moment is always after the deed is done, when the accomplices realize there is only one prize and two hands reaching for it. It's like the Baxter sisters. They conspired to hide their father's will, but once it was hidden, neither could trust the other to keep the secret. Eventually, one of them had to go. The investigation took a sharp turn toward the executive offices. The keys found on the dead man belonged to the library's deputy director, a man who had been remarkably silent since the first death. However, Miss Marple was looking at the situation from a different angle. She was thinking about the fire axe. A professional thief like Elias Vance would not use an axe to enter a vent. He would use a screwdriver and a silent pry bar. The axe suggested a lack of professional skill, a panicked, clumsy effort to hide something, or perhaps to retrieve something that had been lost inside the ducts. She walked toward the basement stairs, her pace slow but purposeful. She found the area cordoned off, but she could see the jagged hole in the metal from the landing. Around the edges of the cut, there were smears of the same oily substance that had been on the De Vere manuscript. It was as if the manuscript itself had been pushed through the hole. The pattern was shifting again. The book in the vault, the one Henderson had been examining when he died, might not have been the real De Vere manuscript at all. If the real book had been stolen and replaced with a poisoned decoy, then the motive wasn't just to save a reputation. It was to facilitate the greatest literary heist of the century. The decoy was the death of him, Miss Marple whispered, her needles clicking with a renewed intensity. He found the watermark, not because he was a genius, but because the murderer wanted him to find it. They wanted him to lean in, touch the pages and gasp in surprise. They didn't just want him dead, they wanted him to be the distraction that covered the theft. And poor Elias Vance was the one who did the heavy lifting, only to find that his employer had no intention of sharing the spoils. As she climbed back up to the main floor, she saw Dr. Helena Vane standing by the window, watching the police cars below. For the first time, the doctor looked less like a corporate executive and more like a woman who had realized the floor beneath her was made of glass. The second death had changed the rules of the game. It was no longer a matter of academic tenure, it was a matter of double homicide. And in the world of Miss Marple, the person who tries to be too clever is usually the one who forgets that every hole you dig has two sides, one to hide the secret and one to trap the person who dug it. The following afternoon, the library was no longer a place of study, but a fortress of suspicion. The second death had stripped away the last vestiges of academic dignity, leaving behind a raw, cold fear. Miss Marple, however, appeared entirely unaffected as she sat in the small glass-walled office that Dr. Helena Vane had been using as a temporary base of operations. She had arrived with a small tin of shortbread, and a look of such earnest, elderly concern that the security guards had waved her through without a second thought. Dr. Vane sat behind a desk piled high with administrative forms, her eyes shadowed by a fatigue that even her impeccable makeup could not entirely hide. She looked like a woman who had calculated every variable, only to find that the equation had changed behind her back. "It is a very trying time for everyone, my dear," Miss Marple began, her needles clicking a soft rhythmic counterpoint to the distant hum of the library's ventilation system. 2 tragedies in as many days. It reminds me so much of the time the old manor house in St. Mary Mead was undergoing renovations. We had a plumber and a carpenter working simultaneously, and neither would speak to the other. They were both so busy guarding their own tools that they didn't notice the foundations were actually being undermined by a leaky pipe. In the end, it wasn't the work they did that mattered, but the things they both chose to ignore. Dr. Vane leaned back, her fingers interlaced. "I'm not sure I see the connection, Miss Marple. The police are dealing with a professional criminal now. It's clear Elias Vance was the architect of this nightmare. He likely killed Henderson to clear his path, and then fell victim to his own clumsy tampering in the basement. It's a sordid, tragic affair, but it has very little to do with scholarship." "Oh, I think it has everything to do with scholarship," Miss Marple said mildly, pausing to adjust her spectacles. "You see, a professional like Mr. Vance doesn't work for himself. He is an agent, a tool used by someone with the knowledge to tell a real treasure from a clever imitation. I was looking at that red plastic tab again this morning. It's quite a specialized piece of equipment, used for the rapid cooling of chemical reagents. I imagine a woman of your brilliance would know exactly how to use such a canister to bypass a thermal air sensor. It's remarkably similar to the way our local chemist, Mr. Thomas, used to preserve his most delicate emulsions. He always said that the secret to a successful experiment was in controlling the environment so perfectly that the subject never even knew it was being changed." The color drained from Dr. Vane's face, leaving it the shade of old vellum. "That is a very specific observation for a visitor, Miss Marple." "I have spent a great deal of time observing," Miss Marple replied. "In a village, one learns that the person who is the loudest in their grief is often the one who is the most relieved. But you, my dear, have been remarkably composed. It's the composition of someone who is still waiting for the other shoe to drop. You see, I don't think Elias Vance died by accident. I think he was waiting for his payment in the basement, the real De Vere manuscript, and instead he received a very final settlement. But the problem with employing a thief is that they often hide things where even their employer cannot find them. That jagged hole in the vent. It looked like someone was looking for something they had lost, didn't it? Something that had been pushed into the ductwork and wouldn't come out." Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and pulled out a small, jagged silver screw, the one she had retrieved from the floor of the vault. She placed it on the desk between them. "I wonder, Dr. Vane, if you've noticed that the ventilation in this office has been rather sluggish today. It reminds me of the time the chimney at the vicarage was blocked by a jackdaw's nest. The smoke didn't go out, it just backed up into the room until everyone was quite literally choked by it. If the real manuscript is still stuck in that shaft, it is only a matter of time before the maintenance crew finds it. And when they do, I imagine they will find your fingerprints on the protective casing, rather than Professor Thorne's." The silence in the room became absolute. Dr. Vane gazed at the screw as if it were a deadly insect. Her hand moved instinctively toward her throat, her eyes darting toward the ceiling. In that single, fleeting moment of panic, the mask of the cool, detached academic shattered. She wasn't looking for a defense. She was looking for an exit. Miss Marple watched her with deep, silent sadness. The psychological game had reached its conclusion. The reaction had not been one of confusion or indignation, but of a calculated fear that had finally run out of variables to manipulate. "The truth is like the rising tide, my dear," Miss Marple whispered. "You can build as many sandcastles as you like, but eventually the water reaches them all. You wanted the reputation and the treasure, but you forgot that a library is built on records, and records have a way of surviving even the most careful fires." The following morning, the atmosphere in the British Library was not one of scholarly pursuit, but of a grim final reckoning. Inspector Slack, having been summoned by a remarkably persistent Miss Marple, stood in the center of the restricted manuscripts vault with a look of profound bewilderment. Gathered around him were the university's legal counsel, a pale and trembling Professor Thorne, recently released but still under a cloud of suspicion, and a motionless Dr. Helena Vane. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant muffled hum of London traffic and the rhythmic, comforting click of Miss Marple's knitting needles as she sat on a small stool by the glass partition. She looked for all the world like a grandmother waiting for a train, yet every eye in the room was fixed upon her. "I believe, Inspector," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying a clarity that seemed to pierce the dusty air, "that we have all been looking at this tragedy as if it were a single-act play, when in fact it was a very clever piece of misdirection with two different directors. We were meant to see a simple case of academic jealousy, a bottle of poison in a locker, a desperate professor, and a tragic accident. It is a very convincing story because it fits what we expect of human nature. Arrogance often leads to violence, as poor Mr. Gregson at the hardware shop in St. Mary Mead could testify after his unfortunate incident with the spanner. But this was no crime of impulse, it was a crime of immense cold-blooded precision." Inspector Slack shifted his weight, his face a mottled red. "The poison was in Thorne's locker, Miss Marple. The chemical analysis confirmed it." "How do you get around that?" "By realizing that the poison was the distraction, not the weapon," Miss Marple replied gently. "The oily substance on the manuscript was indeed a contact irritant, but it was never intended to kill. It was designed to make Mr. Henderson gasp, to force him to take a deep, reflexive breath in a room where the air was no longer safe. You see, the real weapon was delivered through the ventilation system. Dr. Vane used her knowledge of the library's specific climate controls to authorize a maintenance visit by Elias Vance. While he was supposed to be fixing a damp smell, he was actually installing a canister of pressurized gas, a volatile refrigerant that, when combined with the specific humidity of the vault, became a lethal respiratory agent. The red plastic tab I found was the seal from that very canister. It was a domestic error, Inspector, a scientist's tool left in a layman's world." She looked toward Dr. Vane, who remained as still as a statue, but there was a second motive. Dr. Vane didn't just want Mr. Henderson dead because he suspected the forgery. She wanted the De Vere manuscript itself. The book Mr. Henderson was examining was a poison decoy, placed there by Elias Vance during his repair work. The real manuscript was meant to be spirited away through the ventilation ducts. But even the best-laid plans of mice and men, and scholars, go awry. Elias Vance was not just a thief, he was a blackmailer. Once the deed was done, he realized that he held the only evidence that could hang Dr. Vane. He hid the real manuscript within the trunking of the basement, refusing to hand it over until his payment was doubled. "And the second death?" Slack asked, his voice hushed. "A simple matter of elimination," Miss Marple sighed. Dr. Vane could not risk a blackmailer any more than she could risk a whistleblower. She used the same fire axe she had used to discover the breach in the vent to ensure Mr. Vance's silence was permanent. She then attempted to retrieve the manuscript herself, but the metal was too thick and her time was too short. The jagged hole in the basement was her own desperate work. It reminds me so much of the time the local schoolmistress tried to hide a scandalous letter in the church rafters. She was so worried about being caught that she pushed it so far back that she couldn't reach it herself. The more we try to bury our secrets, the more they tend to stick to our fingers. The room remained silent as the weight of the revelation settled. Miss Marple pointed a knitting needle toward the ceiling. "If you look closely at the ventilation grate in this vault, Inspector, you will find that the missing screw was not an accident. It was a gas entry point. And if you look inside the ducting behind Dr. Vane's private office, I believe you will find a very rare, very valuable 15th century manuscript that has been causing quite a blockage in the air supply. The truth, you see, has a way of making itself felt, even when it is tucked away behind marble and steel. As Inspector Slack signaled to his officers, Dr. Vane finally moved. She didn't scream or protest. She simply looked at Miss Marple with a cold, hollow expression of respect. She had been defeated not by a superior intellect, but by a superior understanding of the simple, flawed patterns of the human heart. The Great British Library murder was not a mystery of ancient ink and parchment, but a very modern story of greed, pride, and the tiny domestic mistakes that always lead the way to justice. The following week, the British Library began the slow, arduous process of reclaiming its dignity. The crime scene tape was removed from the reading room, and the heavy scent of almonds and ozone was replaced by the familiar, comforting aroma of old paper and floor wax. The De Vere manuscript was recovered from the ventilation shaft, slightly dusty but otherwise unharmed, and returned to a vault that was now guarded by a far more traditional and far more reliable system of locks and keys. Professor Thorne had retreated to his country house in Sussex, his reputation technically cleared, but his spirit permanently soured by the realization that a woman he had considered a mere subordinate had so easily outmaneuvered him. Miss Marple sat in the small, sun-drenched garden of her nephew's house, her pale blue eyes watching a pair of sparrows bickering over a crust of bread. The urban roar of London felt distant here, muffled by the brick walls and the swaying branches of an ancient oak tree. Raymond West sat opposite her, nursing a cup of tea and looking more thoughtful than usual. The events of the past week had left him with a renewed respect for the quiet, domestic logic that his aunt applied to even the most sophisticated of metropolitan crimes. "It is a strange thing, Aunt Jane," Raymond said, stirring his tea, "that someone as brilliant as Helena Vane could forget that the simplest things, a screw, a plastic tab, a smell, would be her undoing. She spent years mastering the complexities of the 15th century, only to be caught by the basics of the 20th. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking a soft, steady rhythm as she worked on a new pair of mittens for the vicar's granddaughter. "Brilliance is often a very specialized kind of blindness, Raymond. It is like the sun. It allows you to see the distant mountains perfectly, but it can prevent you from seeing the pebbles right at your feet." Dr. Vane was looking at the grand design of her life, the tenure, the fame, the fortune, and she assumed that the small details would simply fall into place. But life is made of small details. It reminds me of poor Mrs. Birtle in St. Mary Mead. She was so focused on winning the flower show that she forgot to water the window box, and the whole thing fell on the postman. She had the most beautiful roses in the county, but she ended up with a lawsuit instead of a trophy. "And the manuscript?" Raymond asked. "I hear the library board is considering a special exhibition to celebrate its recovery." "I hope they do," Miss Marple replied. "But I also hope they remember that knowledge is very fragile. It is not just in the ink and the vellum, but in the integrity of the people who guard it. When that integrity is lost, the book becomes nothing more than a bundle of dead skin and old stains. It's a pity about Mr. Henderson. He was a man who truly loved the past. He didn't want to possess it. He only wanted to understand it. In the end, he was the only one in that entire library who was truly a scholar." The village of St. Mary Mead was calling to her now. She missed the predictable bridge club scandals and the ongoing saga of the butcher's scales. London was a fascinating place, filled with grand buildings and complicated people, but the fundamental patterns of human behavior remained the same. Whether it was a struggle for power in a world-famous library or a dispute over a property line in a country lane, the motives were always the same: greed, fear, and the desperate desire to be more than one truly is. "I think I shall take the afternoon train, Raymond," she said, folding her knitting. "The hollyhocks will be needing attention, and I promised the organist I would look at that pattern for his new surplice. It has been a most interesting visit, but I find that too much history can be quite exhausting. One needs the present to remind oneself that life is still moving forward, even if it does repeat the same old tunes. As she walked toward the station later that day, Miss Marple looked back at the skyline of the city. The great dome of the British Museum stood as a monument to human achievement, a vast repository of everything that had been thought and written. But as she climbed into her carriage and settled into her seat, she knew that the greatest stories weren't always found in the restricted manuscripts. Sometimes they were found in the way a person held their pen, the way they avoided a certain question, or the way a single silver screw lay forgotten on a marble floor. The mystery of the British Library was over, but for Miss Marple, the observation of the human heart was a manuscript that would never truly be closed. She closed her eyes as the train began to move, her mind already drifting toward the peaceful, familiar rows of her own garden,